Hello, welcome to this panel on the limits of free speech around religion. My name's Daphne Whitmore. I'm coming to you from New Zealand and I'm involved in the free speech movement here and also a blog called Redline, which has been involved with Plebity in organising this conference. Very happy to introduce our panelists today. They are Jacob Mchangama and Daniel Ben-Ami. Jacob is a lawyer and a human rights advocate and the author of a book on the history of free speech, which was published just last year. He's the founder and director of Justitia, a Copenhagen-based think tank focusing on human rights, freedom of speech, and the rule of law. And he's got some car problems today, so he's coming to us from a car while he waits to get his fixed. So you can see how dedicated Jacob is to the cause. We also have a very dedicated panelist, Daniel. He runs the Radicalism of Fools website, which is about rethinking anti-Semitism. He's a journalist and has written for many publications, including The Australian, The Economist, the Financial Times, The Guardian, and Spiked. He's also written 2 books and contributed to several others. So welcome, you two.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
We're going to look at the limits of free speech around religion, specifically looking at the idea of blasphemy, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia. In the West, we tend to see the fight against religious authority as something that's really been dealt with long ago. It was the Enlightenment that created the philosophical basis for defending free speech against religion in the West. But it wasn't so long ago that questioning the church canon could lead to arrest, torture, and a painful, fiery death. It's shocking too when we look around the world and see that there are 79 countries that have blasphemy laws on the books. There are even 7 countries that still have death penalties for blasphemy. So I just want to ask, first of all, why is free speech? Why do advocates defend the right to ridicule religion? I mean, is mockery of religion some special category of free speech? I want to ask you, Daniel, first, what you think of that as a category.
Yeah, I mean, I think things have changed over the years, which we can talk about. So, for example, it's more acceptable to ridicule Christianity than it used to be, although other forms of ridicule are less acceptable. But I think precisely because historically it was considered holy, if you like, it was something that people were deeply attached to, they thought was really, really important. And so I think if you believed in free speech, it was very important to stand up for the right to ridicule something that people were so attached to, not just a kind of marginal idea. It's very easy to ridicule things that people see as marginal and crazy. But to have the right to ridicule something which people feel a strong attachment to, I think that's clearly very important if you believe in free speech.
Mm-hmm. And Jacob, what are your thoughts on this issue of why we should have the right to ridicule religion, sort of special category of free speech?
Yeah, thanks, Daphne. And first of all, apologies again. I'm sat in a car dealership in rural Tennessee because I had some car problems and pulled in, and the sweet people here were kind enough to let me jump in a Jeep and do this call. So I also hope the connection is fine. So I think free speech and religion has a long and complicated relationship with religion. I agree very much that authority and religion and identity really are all sort of wound up. And for a long time in history, there was no real separation of politics and religion to the extent that we know it today in open liberal democracies. So to question religion was also to question authority more broadly, and that was not something that was allowed in many places. Now, this does not mean that the relationship between free speech and religion is only one where religion is always oppressive. There have been fruitful exchanges between free speech and religion. So if you go back to medieval times, actually surprisingly, perhaps from today's modern point of view, medieval Islam was a pretty fruitful place for the exchange of ideas. It's not that they recognized free speech the way they did it today, but there were a lot of free thinkers that engaged with religion. Sometimes the price they paid was high, but other times it pushed the permissible boundaries. But I think that especially when religion becomes established, when it becomes, for instance, a state religion, you will see that it tends to become oppressive. So Christianity is a good example. Christians were initially a strange Jewish cult that was on off persecuted by the Roman Empire, but when it became the state religion of the Roman Empire, Christianity started persecuting not only pagans but Christians who believed in the wrong way. In other words, heretics. And so the persecuted became the persecutors, and that that leitmotif has been recurring again and again when Protestantism came along after the Reformation. Protestants were initially persecuted, but then when they set up Protestant states, they immediately started persecuting not only Catholics but also Protestants who believed in the wrong way, so to speak. And so I think it's absolutely crucial in an open democracy that you are able to criticize religious doctrine. And I don't think we would have freedom of religion and free speech in the sense that we enjoy today in open liberal democracies if there hadn't been this willingness to challenge religious doctrine and the role of religion.
Okay, so maybe we should just consider what is religion in terms of a definition. Do we have any sort of working definition, just so for our listeners?
I think that's very difficult because I think it does take different forms at different times. So as you know, a lot of religions, the kind of monotheistic religions like Judaism, Islam, Christianity, have a belief in God at their center. But that's not true of all religions. It's not true of Buddhism or Hinduism in terms of having one unitary kind of God. And then you have what, maybe this is controversial, but what I would consider kind of quasi-religions like environmentalism, when it takes the form almost of a kind of attachment to nature. It's kind of pantheistic, a kind of worship of nature, very often in the form that green thinking takes. So I suppose you could see it as a kind of coherent belief system that people feel attached to, but and maybe Jacob has an alternative, but I can't think of one perfect definition taking all of these different categories.
Does it require a belief in mystical, otherworldly things, or can it be completely sort of material based as an outlook, do you think?
I mean, I think there's probably mystical elements, but it doesn't have to be one single God, one single universal God.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, my view, which I recognize is controversial, is that green thinking, environmentalism, is kind of quite mystical because there's a kind of celebration of nature in there, but it's not religious in the sense of a single God that everyone believes in.
Jacob, what are your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, so I don't know if I'd throw environmentalism in there, but it's certainly, you can find all kinds of people who are so committed to an idea that it becomes sort of essentialist in many ways, where they try to deduce everything from certain from certain core beliefs that can come to resemble the way that religious people might have a very essentialist commitment to ideas in a holy book, say. But I think it's interesting that the word religion comes from I believe religio in Latin, which means something like binding together, and I think that helps explain why. First of all, religion is a very powerful organizing force for a society, especially as it becomes a civilization, but also why it has a baked-in tendency to become intolerant, and maybe even an incentive to become intolerant, because if religion is what binds a society together, then first of all, that is powerful. You identify with others who hold those same beliefs, but those that are being bound together, if there are people who reject the core tenets of the ideas, of the beliefs that bind society together, then they endanger that society. So if you start rejecting or questioning the doctrines of the Catholic Church, well, then you could be said to be endangering all of Christendom and the beliefs that bind it together. And if you believe that those beliefs that bind you together are also the pathway to salvation, well, then you can see why you might sincerely believe that you're doing good by being intolerant, because you're purging people who not only endanger their own souls, but endanger all of Christendom by corrupting people with dangerous ideas, and might even invite the wrath of God, because you start rejecting those ideas that bind you together. And I think that's a powerful motivation for intolerance. Of course, the ideas that bind us together need not necessarily be religious. So they could also be secular ideas that are so strongly held to believe that create a particular identity. It could be, it could be nationalism, ethnicity, and so on. And so when that explains why intolerance is not limited to religion.
Mm-hmm. So I'll put this to you, Daniel, then, like, how do we manage then, say, the right to blaspheme and also uphold the right for people to have religious freedom?
I don't see that they're necessarily contradictory. I mean, I think people should have the right to blaspheme. If by blaspheme you mean to mock,
yes,
different religious beliefs, whatever that religion is. I think Jacob and I probably agree on this, that it's really very important to have the right to mock people's deeply held religious beliefs. But I don't think that necessarily contradicts the people having deeply held religious convictions and being able to practice their religion. I mean, as long as their religion doesn't involve actively harming other people. I mean, if you had some bizarre religion that believed in cannibalism, for example, I mean, there's no such religion, but just to illustrate the point that if you did have that kind of thing, you might need to say, well, okay, this is very harmful to, in a very direct sense, to the whole of society, and you might need to put some kind of restriction on it. But on the whole, as long as it doesn't conflict with the harm principle, that you're doing active harm to other people, then I think people should be free to practice their religious beliefs. And others may find their religious beliefs very weird and strange. And I think all religions, really, you can find aspects which seem pretty weird. But if people want to practice them, then they should be free to do so.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I want to ask you too, Daniel. Oh, sorry, carry on, Jacob. Yeah, if you've got something you wanted to add.
Yeah, and really, it would be impossible for multiple religions, especially sub-branches of the same religion, to coexist if you didn't accept the idea of blasphemy or heresy. So, think about, if I'm if I'm a Unitarian, for instance, then I reject core beliefs of mainline Christian sects, and my beliefs may then be seen as blasphemy or heretical. I'm still a religious believer, but I might hold beliefs that other religious denominations reject. In the same way, if you're a Christian and a Muslim, you could say that the other holds ideas about the world, about the nature of the world, about the nature of God, and about the nature of truth, that on core issues simply reject what you consider to be the truth, what you consider to be the true nature of God, and are thus could thus be seen to be sort of blasphemous. So it's not only a conflict between those who are secular and those who are religious. It's also very much a conflict between various religions, and that conflict has been arguably even more bloody than the than the conflict between those who are religious and those who are not religious. And so really, it would be impossible to live in a world of open ideas if you insisted that there was no right to blasphemy, and that you didn't have a right to offend religious feelings or religious ideas. It would be impossible to have any kind of open exchange, and you would, very likely, either you would have to say, well, each and every religious denomination gets to have their own taboos. No one can challenge them, and then it would be very difficult to have any kind of meaningful discussion about anything. Or you would have to say, well, there's one religion who gets to decide on the truth, and no one else can challenge their beliefs. And I think when you think really hard about it, those of us who benefited from free and open societies, many of the ideas that we take for granted really are based in part on the ability to reject or question religious ideas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, well, Daniel, you've written and talked about in the past quite a bit about the distinction that you see, so between Islam as a religion and Islamism. So this is where we, I think, see today many conflicts around this terminology and Islamophobia playing out. Can you explain to us how you see that distinction?
Yeah, and I think there's a big problem that this discussion isn't really, in the categories, not really well understood in the West, because I think what is often called Islamophobia nowadays is only relatively recent. I mean, it's only become a popular category in the last 20 or 30 years. But it seems to me it lumps together three different things which are very unhelpful to lump together. So there's mocking the Muslim religion, that's one thing. There's hatred of individual Muslims, which I think is probably better called anti-Muslim bigotry. And then the thing people are generally least aware of is there's Islamism, which you referred to, which is really a political movement. So it's a political movement which has its own kind of ideologues, has its own political goals, wants to have a kind of international Islamic order. It's not really keen on nation states. And so I think people should be free to attack all of those things if they want. People should be free to mock the Islamic religion, as with other religions too. People should be free to express hatred of Muslims. People should be free to criticize Islamism as a political movement. But the problem is they're often lumped together, and particularly by Islamists. So when people criticize Islamist political movements, which have particular hostility to Jews, for example, which is very central to their doctrine, which want a kind of international Islamist order. When people criticize Islamism, or the Islamists, and often leftists as well, will say, oh, you're being Islamophobic, and imply that the critics are actually, they hate Muslims and they're kind of anti-Muslim bigots, which really confuses the discussion. So in all of these elements of this discussion, I think there should be maximum freedom. But I think Islamophobia is a problematic category, but by muddying together these different things, it's hard to be clear about what's really going on in each case.
And Jacob, I guess you've had experience in Denmark around issues to do with Islam, cartoons, free speech. Have you got any thoughts on that, sort of the distinctions there that Daniel's outlined?
Yeah, no, I think that unfortunately today, in the world we live in today, overall, if you look at surveys of openness to questioning religious doctrine, of offending religious feelings, unfortunately, it is true that in Muslim majority states, the tolerance for that is much lower than in Western societies. And it is also true that if you look at Denmark, for instance, those Danes with a Muslim who are Muslims are also tend overall to be less tolerant of religious mockery. So that creates a tension, and this is not to denigrate. There are a number of incredibly brave Muslims in Denmark, and especially in the Muslim majority world, who risk a lot more than I do for speaking out, who are sincerely believing Muslims, but who just do not want an intolerant sort of political superstructure imposed on non-believers or heterodox Muslims. But that creates tensions, especially in open societies, and it comes, that plays into this well-intentioned, I think, on the part of many in the West to say, well, the West has an ugly history of discrimination against minorities. Therefore, when Muslims say that they feel mocked and ridiculed and marginalized based on criticism or mockery of Islam, well, that tends to be discrimination or hate speech or the like, when the very same kind of ideas aimed at Christianity was something that people on the left, for instance, would have rejoiced in and supported vehemently, unconditionally, and seen as emancipatory. But being able to challenge Islamic doctrines is also emancipatory. It doesn't magically change nature just because Muslims are a minority within Western countries, and particularly because very often we saw that with the Khatun crisis in Denmark. We also saw it with Salman Rushdie, that Muslim majority states that have draconian blasphemy laws actively supported or actively fanned the flames of intolerance. So it was not just a marginalized group of a minority group of Muslims within the West. It was also Muslim majority states that used all of their state power to try to shut down debate on Islam. And you also see that today with campaigns in the United Nations, where Muslim majority states try to conflate the concept of hate speech and Islamophobia, saying that if you make caricature drawings of the Muslim Prophet Muhammad, well, that is tantamount to incitement to hatred against Muslims, which I think is a very unconvincing idea. There is a problem on that front.
Do you think then, in a way, I think I've heard you speak on the subject too, that hate speech then becomes a form of, hate speech regulations can become a form of blasphemy laws, or parallel with that?
Yeah, well, the problem with hate speech laws are they're so malleable and inherently vague and broad, so that they can, really come to protect any ideas that those, and let's not forget, hate speech laws will almost by definition be defined and enforced by those who are powerful. So this idea that hate speech laws serve to sort of protect the marginalized and powerless against the powerful might sound tempting on paper, but very often is at odds with reality, just because they tend to reflect the ideas and orthodoxies of those who are in power. And so it's certainly seen over and over again that hate speech laws in many states have become sort of the thin veneer of legitimacy that laws to punish dissent and that is true also when it comes to religion. And I think it's a very powerful strategy for Muslim majority states to say, well, look, all countries in Europe have hate speech laws, and therefore we're not going to call for Islamophobia to be banned necessarily under blasphemy laws, but we're going to say that the concept of Islamophobia amounts to hate speech, and therefore, it should be punished. And it's legitimate to do so because you do the same in the West. And, you have other problems in that sometimes, even in Western countries, the concept of blasphemy and hate speech becomes sort of intertwined and really a gray zone, even by certain courts, even by the European Court of Human Rights, which I think is deeply shameful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What
Can
are
I
your
just come
thoughts,
back on a
Dan?
couple of
Yes.
things Jacob
Yeah.
said? I mean, I don't know, maybe this is not the time to go into, but I agree with the thrust of his argument, kind of pro-free speech, pro-freedom argument, but my take is a bit different. I mean, in relation to Islamism, I do see it as a political movement that uses an Islamic idiom, uses Islamic language. So, for example, if you take Sayyid Qutb, he's the kind of number one ideologue of Islamism. He very much saw it as a political movement. He posed it as an alternative to conservatism and liberalism and Western ideologies. And there are all sorts of political movements like the Muslim Brotherhood, spin-offs from the Muslim Brotherhood, which are influenced by Islamism or Islamist movements. So it's a bit of a confused area because I think you have politics and religion kind of muddled up together. But I think to really understand it, it's important to understand that Islamism is not just an extreme form of a religion, it's actually a political movement in a religious form. The other point I wanted to make, which I think is a really interesting shift, and maybe definitely planning to come to this anyway, but it is really interesting. I mean, if you just take Britain as an example, but I think it applies to other countries too. Say 50 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, it wasn't really acceptable to mock Christianity in a lot of circles. It would be considered blasphemous and out of order, and there were blasphemy laws. And now, on the whole, it's pretty okay to mock Christianity. But it's interesting how it's become much less acceptable to mock Islam as a religion. And I think the reason for that is that it links to the way that society has become very into victimhood, validating victimhood, saying we need to organize ourselves around being on the side of the victims. And Muslims are seen as the victims of Western oppression and discrimination. And in that kind of victim-orientated societies, it's not generally considered acceptable to criticize Islam, but you can criticize Christianity, even though these are majority Christian societies. So it's a very peculiar situation that we're in, and quite a complicated one.
And I guess layered into that too is the consequences are somewhat different too. When we see what people like Salman Rushdie faced, but we can come to that a bit further on. I was wanting to ask you, Daniel, sort of related to this question, there's anti-Semitic speech, and there's a lot of debate too about what constitutes anti-Semitism, and this is something we wanted to look at in this discussion. Do you think, is there a good working definition? How do we know if something's anti-Semitic, or is it simply a distinct anti-Zionist critique and so on? There's a big debate around that these days.
There is a big debate, undoubtedly, but I don't think it's generally a particularly productive debate. There's all these different organizations like the IHRA and the Jerusalem definition, different definitions of anti-Semitism, and the difference is mainly boiled down to the attitude towards Israel, to what extent you're allowed to criticize Israel in these different definitions. But I don't like these definitions for a couple of reasons. First of all, because I think anti-Semitism is a very complex phenomenon. So beyond the kind of general, hatred of Jews, that kind of thing, it's very hard to give it a clear definition because it takes very different forms at different times. And also, I think these work, despite what people sometimes claim, the defenders of these definitions, I think they're often used to clamp down on free speech. So they'll say initially, well, the IHRA definition, for example, which is the most mainstream, most popular definition, the claim is, well, it's just an indication, it's not really meant to clamp down on free speech. But then what you have is lawyers and others coming along and saying to people, well, it's illegal to, if someone accepts this definition, say a government department or a local authority or a government itself, if someone breaks this definition, then it's hate speech and you're breaking the law. So I think that these definitions are also problematic because they're against free speech. So I think people should be allowed to express hatred of Jews, which is what anti-Semitism is about. But I think people who are opposed to that, like myself, should very, very clearly challenge that hatred and argue against it and argue why it's wrong. But I don't think these kind of technocratic definitions help at all. If anything, they make it more difficult to have a clear debate about it.
Jacob, do you think there's a place for definitions, or does it not matter anyway? I mean, if we're going to defend free speech, we want to know what ugly thoughts there are out there anyway, if we're going to counter them. And but do you think there should be some real limits there?
Well, obviously, well, perhaps not obviously. I do think it's useful to have terminology in place, but where what I would disagree with is having legal definitions that prohibit based on what will always be subjective definitions. So, for instance, Israel-Palestine debate is sort of the classic one, right? You will never get, you would never, based on your sympathies in that conflict, you would have very different ideas on where the line should be drawn between criticism of Israel and Israeli policies and anti-Semitism, for instance. So whoever got to define that definition, it would favor one or the other sides if they had the power to police the speech of that particular debate. So I very much agree that you should be allowed to express anti-Semitism up to the line where you're sort of actively encouraging some tangible harm, such as violence against Jews and advocating it, inciting it in a very direct manner. And I also agree that the flip side of that is that those of us who are committed to free speech and tolerance and equality then have a moral obligation to use our own free speech to condemn those who we think cross the moral line between hatred, anti-Semitism, and sort of pure debate, if you like. And that's what free speech does. It does allow you to have that discussion. It also allows you to shine a light on those who are anti-Semites, because they clearly are out there, and they are, they're not just among Muslims. They're also in the West. So I think it's important to show that. I've never been convinced that you're more safe trying to sort of play whack-a-mole against intolerant, hateful speech than actually showing that maybe some of your neighbors, some of your colleagues, maybe, and at very least some of your compatriots have anti-Semitic or racist views, and knowing who those people are who voice it, and also learning to maybe see what drives those ideas, and maybe also what's the most effective counter arguments. And I think free speech and access to information is the best remedy in that regard.
Indeed. Shall we just move on and look at some examples, perhaps, where maybe religion and free speech are challenging each other somewhat? Like, for example, a street preachers, this is an example of something that happened in New Zealand not that long ago. Street preachers were outside a gay bar and they were saying that homosexual acts are a sin. So do gay people have the right to gather without having God botherers accosting them at the entranceway? Should there be restrictions on proselytizing? Daniel, Jacob, you go. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I think you want some public order restrictions in place, but they should be viewpoint neutral. So it should not be the fact, if there are rowdy Christian preachers outside a gay bar, they certainly should have the right to say things that members of the LGBT community find offensive. They should certainly have the right to express their moral condemnation if they think homosexuality is morally wrong and a sin that conflicts with their view of morality and the good life. But if they were to do it in such a way that it threatened public order, regardless, in a way that it didn't matter what the message was, that's where I would draw the line. So in the same way, you could say, if I was to have a debate meeting, then there could be public order restrictions on free speech. You would not be allowed to interrupt speakers, but those should not be enforced on the basis of whether on the political opinions of the hecklers. So it would be the mere fact that you actually try to disrupt speech rather than you expressing certain viewpoints, and that would be my guiding principle as well when it comes to those things. So I think you should absolutely have the right to proselytize, but obviously, if you proselytize in the streets, if you say, Jehovah's Witnesses, that's the best thing since sliced bread, you should have the right to do so. If I politely tell you I'm not interested, you might say, well, can I convince you? If I insist on saying no, well then, and you keep following me, then there comes a time where you'd say, okay, you no longer have the right to proselytize against me, because I've very actively said that I don't want, I don't need any convincing. I don't want to be for you to try to convince me. I'm not interested in your message. But again, that has nothing to do with the proselytizers being members of Jehovah's Witnesses or any other religious group. That's a public order consideration, and not one that is based on political or philosophical or religious viewpoints. So that would be my guiding principle.
And Daniel, your thoughts on that?
I agree with that. I mean, just to preface my remarks, I mean, I live in just a regular London suburb, nothing outstanding about it at all. But in the Underground station, which is maybe about a mile from where I'm sitting, it's kind of average London Underground station. A few months ago, there was a Christian preacher preaching outside, and he was arrested just for preaching. I mean, there was no kind of gay club or anything like that in that particular case. So it's really outrageous, and it shows that this does happen in supposedly democratic, civilized Western countries. I agree with Jacob's take very much. I suppose a lot of these discussions about free speech, including this one, are about kind of where do you draw the line between violence and speech. So I think clearly here all of us are in favour of free speech. Clearly all of us, I think, would be against that crossing the line and becoming violence. But the problem is the actual kind of where you draw that borderline between the two, which is why incitement is often a kind of big theme in these free speech debates. And I think we need to be very, very careful about that, because just upsetting someone, for example, some people might see that as a kind of psychic violence, and I don't think we should accept that. I mean, it has to be when it really is becoming crossing the line and say, okay, let's go and hurt this person, let's go and kill this person, or kind of really getting a crowd up to attack people. I think then we can say, okay, it's crossed the line. but not just because people feel upset. So in your example, people in the gay club, they may justifiably feel upset that there are kind of anti-gay bigots preaching outside. But the fact that they feel upset, I don't think is a reason to stop the bigots doing that. They should be free to do that. But if it seems like it's crossing the line into a kind of something more physical, then I think that should be ruled out of order.
Well, what about take the example of abortion clinics, demonstrations outside abortion clinics? Are they free speech? Some countries, I think Britain has a law against that now. In New Zealand, we do. There's I can't remember how far it is, maybe it's half a kilometre or so. You're not allowed to demonstrate within certain boundaries of abortion clinics. So is that a limit to free speech, or and free assembly? Do you think, Daniel? What's your feelings on that question?
I was worried you might ask me that, because that's one of the most difficult things.
Yeah.
I've been trying to grapple with in relation to free speech.
I feel a bit of a bob each way myself on this question, but yeah.
I mean, as I understand it, there have been these kind of, often kind of elderly Catholic types who've had quiet protests outside abortion clinics in Britain for many years. And no one has, or not no one, but generally people haven't complained about it. And even sometimes the people in the abortion clinics have made them a cup of tea just to keep them happy. But I think what is happening now is something a bit different, because you have people going in for consultations related to abortion or possible abortions. And then you have protesters very, very aggressively trying to traumatize them and guilt trip them in a very kind of proactive, aggressive way, which is why I think you now have these buffers in Britain. Maybe the law is probably a bit different in New Zealand, but buffer zones outside abortion clinics to stop that happening. And I think reluctantly, I do probably think that is reasonable, because you're not taking people in a normal situation, you're taking people who are patients for an operation, a particular kind of operation, and people are very aggressively trying to traumatize them and stop them doing that. So I think on balance, in that case, I would say that their freedom, and the freedom of these very aggressive protesters, should be curtailed. But maybe you have a different view, or Jacob has a different view, but I think that's my current take on it.
Jacob, have you got anything? Is there something similar in Denmark, or is it? And what are your thoughts on that kind of restriction?
I think 97% of the Danish population are firmly in favor of the right to abortion. So it's not really, though, where I've just moved to Tennessee, abortion is now banned.
Okay.
So and the flip side of what you're saying is that I think now some states in the US are trying to prohibit or censor, if you like, sort of abortion consultation. So I don't know if Tennessee has done that, but some states have sort of floated the idea that you could, if someone was to counsel online, for instance, women where they could get an abortion when it was illegal in that state, that could be, they could be punished for that, which would be a violation of free speech in my book. I think that the issue is here is, again, I don't think those who are opposed to abortion based on moral, ethical, religious grounds must have a right to do so. And I think they must also have a right to do so in places where they want that message to be seen to become effective. That does not mean that when you have, for instance, vulnerable people, that they have to be able to do it sort of 1 yard outside. So you could say that there should be a perimeter, but if it's half a mile, I think that's probably that's probably too far away. So and there's a very interesting case from the US about this sort of virulent sect, fundamentalist Christian sect, and one of their shticks was to show up at funerals of dead American soldiers, called the Westboro Baptist Church, and they would show up with these banners, basically a family, an extended family, and they would have these banners that said, "Thank God for dead soldiers," and so it was basically their idea, I think, was that American soldiers being killed in Iraq and Afghanistan was the just punishment for God for America tolerating homosexuality and other types of sins. And that, you can imagine, if you're burying your child who has lost their life in a war, and you see people those kinds of hateful messages, that could be quite traumatic. And that case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, well, those protesters have a right to do so. They don't have a right to sort of be present at the ceremony.
Mm-hmm.
But if there are certain measures in place that allow sort of the immediate privacy of the family, then you can't restrict the First Amendment rights to free speech and assembly of these protesters. And I think that's sort of the flip. That's the same argument with abortion clinics. So if there's a young woman who's vulnerable, her health might be endangered, you don't have the right to run up to her and yell in her face. There's some reasonable protection there, but at the same time, you do certainly should have the right to make your feelings about abortion known, including to those people who want to have an abortion. That's the part of free speech that is not nice, and that can evoke deep feelings, and really be hurtful. Because let's face it, free speech can be hurtful in many ways.
Yeah, well, that kind of leads in nicely to sort of another example I was thinking of is burning a crucifix outside a church. Free speech too. Would you say that's allowable in the same grounds?
Yeah. So I think again there would be some context you would need to take into account. So obviously you don't have the right to enter the property of the church and put up the same way you don't have a right to. I couldn't enter if I disagree with your views, I couldn't enter your garden and put up my message. But if you were to put a cross in front of the church in a way that didn't disrupt public, I wouldn't say. I would say yes. There could be specific context. So, for instance, here in the South, burning crosses. If you were to put a cross outside an African American family's house, a burning cross, that could, the context could very well be that you're sending a death threat to this particular family because there's a history of burning crosses as part of the KKK. So that might be an exception where you said, well, this actually is incitement to violence and a real threat. But that would be different from the situation where you do it outside a church and where your message might be that you disagree, you view the church as being holding ideas that are deeply detrimental and immoral, and so on. And I think that should, in the abstract, be allowed.
And Daniel, are your thoughts on something comparable? Was it, say, a swastika painted on a footpath outside a synagogue? Should that be protected as free speech?
I mean, I suppose here one of the things we're talking about, at least implicitly, is the boundary between public and private. So that if someone walked into a synagogue carrying a swastika, that would be one thing. If they painted a swastika outside, I mean, I guess with all these things, it depends on the context.
It would be graffiti, right? I mean, that wouldn't be protected. Yeah.
So I didn't know what you said.
Graffiti. Yeah, it would be graffiti.
So
graffiti on the synagogue, I think that's really on private property, so that would be unacceptable. But if someone wanted to paint a swastika on the pavement outside in the public sphere, then again, it depends on the context, if it was meant to be a very direct and clear physical threat. But I suppose I would say that generally people should be free to do that, although it's a pretty horrible thing to do.
Yeah, I think one of the most impressive sort of and brave defenses I've seen along these lines is Salman Rushdie. So there was a time when a group of Islamists were demonstrating in London, and they were holding up these placards that said, "Behead those who insult Islam." And Salman Rushdie is someone who a lot of people think has insulted Islam, and so he was asked, "Surely this crosses the line?" And he said, "No, listen, I find that message abhorrent, but they're not making a direct, imminent threat." And this, came from someone who had lived with the very real threats of being attacked and worse by people with violent religious ideas. So I thought that was a particularly impressive commitment to free speech that sums up, I think, where the line should be drawn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course, sadly last year he was attacked, and someone who did want to carry out the fatwa, and he now has severe. So yeah, it's a real tribute to free speech, his attitude, isn't it? Last year in the UK, Daniel, there was a school teacher who was suspended for offending Muslim sensibilities, for showing the cartoons of Muhammad. The Danish cartoons, I think. It was in a class on religion and free expression, and I understand he's still in hiding.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think should be done to, say, defend that teacher? When you think, the state did protect Salman Rushdie for many decades, but it seems today that the teacher is in hiding, and I don't know if there are any resources that are there to protect him.
Yeah, I don't know. I know about the case in general, but I don't know about his, to the extent he's being protected. I mean, he's certainly de facto lost his job. And what he was trying to do was, as I understand it, was to have a discussion about free speech and blasphemy. So it's interesting that I suspect if he had had some kind of classic blaspheming image of Jesus, of Christ, he probably wouldn't have had that trouble. I think probably the Islamist groups were protesting, were part of the whole protest movement against him and the threats against him. But I think the really important thing is to create an atmosphere where we argue that is unacceptable. People should be free to express their views, even though those views will upset people. Kind of a more robust view of individuals and what individuals can go through. And I think that it is obligatory that the state, once, in that case, it very clearly moves over to violence, or the threat of violence. And the state should very clearly take a very hard line on anyone who does start threatening violence. So, and I think the two go together, that if you believe speech should be as free as possible, then it seems to me the flip side of that is if people do cross the line to violence, then you should take a very, very hard line on them. Whereas it seems to me what happens today is often the opposite, that we kind of classify all sorts of things as hate speech and try and stop people expressing particular views. But then if they do cross the line into violence, then often not that much happens, which I think is completely the wrong way around.
And I think we see that having an effect on even people who are very, very outspoken are now self-censoring, fearing threats of violence and other threats, I guess, too. I'm thinking specifically of a recent example with the scientist Richard Dawkins, who's been outspoken his entire life on religion. And he was in an interview with Piers Morgan recently, and he refused to discuss Islam. And the implication was that there would be threats that would follow. He just wasn't prepared to go there. What do you think this says about the current state of free speech, specifically in Britain, and perhaps we could say generalize it a little to the West today?
I mean, I think it shows that if we do give in to these kinds of attacks on people, this kind of moral pressure on people, physical threats on people, and if we don't stand up for free speech, then we give a signal that this kind of behavior, this kind of threatening behavior, is acceptable to people. And then it does have a real chilling effect once that happens. So in other words, I think we need to make clear that free speech is an ideal to uphold, that people need to be resilient, that there could be good reasons why they're upset by what people say, but they should be able to take it. And if people cross the line into violence, they should be punished very severely. But when those things don't happen, then you have a real chilling effect and people do get scared, and you can understand why people are scared.
Jacob,
I agree. I mean,
your
it's
thoughts?
it's the jihadist veto, if you like, in the sense that you can certainly understand why a lot of people are afraid to speak out. There's a bloody trail of people who have used their speech to offend or be, at least according to Islamist groups, Islam, and who paid a very high price for doing so, and a lot of others who are probably only alive today because states have taken measures to protect them, or they've gone into hiding. And so I think it's deeply problematic when governments try to paint it as a picture of, we also have to be, we have to show respect and be tolerant. Well, who are the intolerant ones? The intolerant ones are those who are willing to use violence to silence ideas that they don't like. That's intolerance for you. Real tolerance means suffering ideas that you abhor and that you don't agree with. That's the definition of tolerance. But we've sort of, it's in some ways turned the very concept of tolerance around. Tolerance and free speech go hand in hand. They're two sides of the same coin, but we've sort of, I would say, eroded the understanding of tolerance. So to the extent where we say, tolerance means that you have to respect certain ideas and self-censor, but I think that's a dangerous form of tolerance, and one that is ultimately incompatible with a free and open society. And therefore, I think that open governments should be, democratic government should be much more assertive in defending, not only committing the resources to defending people threatened by violence, against such violence, but also taking a firm moral stand rather than sort of all kinds of wishy-washy statements that try to sort of say, on the one hand this, and the other hand that. Reacting to speech with violence is simply unacceptable. And one of the reasons why we enjoy a free and open societies is because we have built societies where we now can, offend religious ideas. I mean, let's not, if you go to the United Kingdom, in the first half of the 19th century, people would go to jail for years and years for blasphemy, for selling champagne in the streets of London to the lower classes. That was a punishable offense, and a lot of people spent a long time in prison for doing that, because the idea was that you couldn't sort of expose the uneducated lower classes to ideas that would sap their faith, because then the structures of the class-based British society would collapse. And fortunately, those are no longer the prevailing ideas. And I think we're in a better place, and Britain is in a better place for no longer enforcing such red lines. So why would you allow private groups to to do the same through violence. That's eroding the fundamental values of the open society.
Well,
Yeah,
thank you. Yes, Daniel.
Yeah, I agree with what Jacob just said. I think one perhaps useful maxim is to talk about the right to be offensive. So you don't really need free speech to say things that are very bland and mainstream, because they'll be accepted anyway. But a fundamental maxim of genuine free speech is that you can say things that will upset people, that people find offensive, which doesn't mean you shouldn't really be doing it gratuitously, although you can do it if you want to. But yeah, the free speech means being able to say things that will upset people, that people will find offensive, that will annoy people. That's a key element of free speech, which I think is in line with what Jacob was arguing as well.
But I try not to gratuitously offend, but I would say that there are certainly times where maybe it's called for. So recently, 2 Iranians were executed for blasphemy, and apparently one of the reasons that they had on Telegram had shown videos of a burning Quran. Now, if you live in a theocratic state like Iran, where religion and politics are deeply intertwined, and where that is being used to oppress the majority of the population and force laws and morals and values upon them, well, of course you want to challenge it, and maybe you want to send a message by burning your hijab or burning a Quran, because that's a very forceful way of saying, listen, I don't accept these religious values that you're forcing upon me. The same way that if you're in the US and you're fighting against the Vietnam War, you might burn the American flag. Now that's deeply offensive to a lot of people, but it's a powerful way of making a statement. You could characterize it as gratuitously offensive. That might be true, but it's also a way to really put your point across, that you feel very strongly about certain things, and that is certainly a way that certain arguments have been advanced. Polite debate, reasoned debate, that might be sort of the gold standard for advancing things in human affairs. But let's face it, that's not the only way things are going to be changed. Issues on racial discrimination, slavery, and so on, protest, loud protest, provocative statements, all these things have played a part as well. The right for the lower classes in Britain to get political representation was not just learned pamphlets. That was also being out in the streets. It was ridiculing, mocking the higher classes, religion, and so on. So that is part and parcel of free speech.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you both. That's a very good note for us to finish on, I think. And I just want to thank both of you really for your thoughtful comments and the work that you both do too for fighting for and defending free speech. And look forward to having further conversations.
Well, definitely, yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great meeting you, Daniel.
Yeah, and you, Jacob. Cheers.
And good luck with your sorting your car out.
Thanks.